Good afternoon, everyone. It's time for Mrs. Ballou Reads. And this week we're starting a brand new book because we finished The Dragon of the Red Dawn by Mary Pope Osborne. And this book was suggested to me by a family here in town. And we didn't own it, but I looked into it and I thought it would be a good read aloud. So I purchased it and we're going to start it today. It's a really thick book, but that's because there's 3 stories in here. We're going to read the first one. And then we'll decide at the end of that one whether or not we're going to continue with story number 2 or whether we're going to start a new book. So our book that we're starting now is TumTum and Nutmeg, Adventures Beyond Nutmouse Hall. And it's by Emily Byrne and pictures are by Nick Price. It says 1 book, 2 mice, 3 excellent adventures. And this book is published by Little Brown and Company. And this first story that we're going to read in here is entitled TumTum and Nutmeg. TumTum and Nutmeg. There'll be a few pictures. Chapter 1. Once there were 2 married mice called Mr. and Mrs. Nutmouse, and they lived in great style. They had a big rambling house with a ballroom and a billiards room and a banqueting room and a butler's pantry, and just about every other sort of room a married couple might want. There were 36 rooms in all. Does your house have 36 rooms? My goodness. The house was called Nutmouse Hall, and it was situated in the broom cupboard of a small human dwelling called Rose Cottage. A broom cupboard might not sound like a very grand place for a house, but this broom cupboard was special. It had creamy white walls, mottled red tiles on the floor, and a tiny sash window hidden behind a curtain of honeysuckle. But the nicest thing of all about the broom cupboard was that no human knew it was there. This is because a very long time ago, soon after Rose Cottage was built, someone pushed a big Welsh dresser against the kitchen wall, hiding the broom cupboard door from view. And the dresser always stayed there because there was nowhere else to put it. It was Mr. Nutmouse's great-great-great-grandfather who first discovered the broom cupboard when he crept beneath the dresser and poked his nose under the door. The red tiles and white walls looked so appealing that he decided to build a house there straight away. And the first thing he had to do was build a big round mouse hole so that his workmen could get in and out with all their bricks and cement mixers. Then he fitted the mouse hole with smart iron gates, and as soon as a mouse entered those gates, he was on the Nutmouse family's territory. Nutmouse Hall was built in the middle of the broom cupboard, and it was a very fine piece of architecture. The walls were made of pretty pebble stone, and there were gables in the windows and little turrets peeking out of the roof. The front of the house faced south, so the bedroom windows caught the sun as it filtered through the honeysuckle. The smallest rooms, such as the bathrooms, were the size of a cake tin, while the ballroom was the size of a hamper. And hamper-sized rooms seemed very big to the Nutmouses, since they were only 2 inches tall. Because Nutmouse Hall was so enormous, Mr. and Mrs. Nutmouse did not use all the rooms available to them. Mr. Nutmouse spent most of the time in his library, warming his toes in front of the fire, and Mrs. Nutmouse spent most of her time scurrying about in her kitchen, making delicious things to eat. Mr. and Mrs. Nutmouse had been married a long time, but they still called each other by the affectionate pet names they had adopted during their engagement. Mrs. Nutmouse called Mr. Nutmouse TumTum, because he had such a large one. And TumTum called Mrs. Nutmouse Nutmeg because she had nutmeg hair. TumTum thought this was very exotic because his family had all been grays. In their funny way, the Nutmouses were well suited to each other. TumTum was a wise, bookish sort of mouse. He never lost his temper or got agitated, and he did everything very calmly and slowly. Nutmeg was quite the opposite. She did things 19 to the dozen, and even little tasks such as putting the icing on a cake could get her into a terrible dither. But in her hasty way, she was surprisingly efficient. The house was spick and span, the bills were paid on time, and the food served at Nutmouse Hall was the envy of all the mice for miles around. TumTum looked upon each meal as a celebration. For breakfast, there would be eggs and bacon and toast and marmalade. Lunch was all manner of cold meats and salads. For afternoon tea, there was always a homemade cake or scone, and supper would be a delicacy such as earwigs en croûte. Nutmeg had a whole shelf of cookbooks, so she was never short of inspiration. TumTum was not as rich as his ancestors had been, and this was because he gave most of his money away. He supported all sorts of charities, charities for homeless mice, charities for arthritic mice, charities for illiterate mice. That means they can't read. Charities for bald mice. There's a picture of them. He even supported a charity for mice with hiccups. So one way or another, the Nutmouses did not have much money left. They did not employ a butler or a maid, and they could not afford to give banquets in a banqueting room, nor balls in their barroom. But since neither of them much liked balls and banquets, they didn't mind a bit. And Nutmeg was such a good housekeeper that life was splendid all the same. But beyond the broom cupboard, where the humans lived, things were not splendid at all. Rose Cottage was owned by Mr. Mildew, a widower who lived there with his 2 children, Arthur and Lucy. They were very poor, and they did not have nearly so many rooms as the Nutmouses had. There was one bathroom, which was only a little bit bigger than the bath, and Arthur and Lucy shared a tiny bedroom in the attic with a ceiling that leaked. From the outside, Rose Cottage looked very inviting. The garden was full of pear trees and wildflowers, and the honeysuckle trailed all over the stone walls and curled along the fat fringe of the thatch. But inside it was less agreeable. Every room was rife with clutter and chaos. The walls were damp, and the plaster was beginning to crumble. The beams in the living room were full of woodworms, and the carpet was so threadbare you could see through to the floorboards, which was full of woodworms too. The boiler had packed up long ago, and in winter the wind howled into the kitchen through the cracks in the garden door. The cottage had been much better cared for when Mrs. Mildew was alive, but she had died a long time ago when Arthur was still a baby. He couldn't remember his mother at all, and Lucy could only remember her lying in bed looking very thin and white with a fat doctor standing over her. She'd been told the name of her illness once, but it had been much too peculiar a word for her to remember. The Mildew children did not miss having a mother because they could remember what having one had been like, and yet they knew that there were certain disadvantages to being without one, and they considered living in chaos to be among them. But Mr. Mildew was such a head-in-the-clouds sort of fellow that he hardly seemed to notice how squalid Rose Cottage had become. He was an inventor by trade, and he spent all his time crashing about in his tiny study upstairs trying to invent things. Years ago, he had invented a gadget for peeling grapes, which had been sold in a department store in London, and it had made him quite rich for a time. But people weren't buying his grape peelers anymore, so now he needed to invent something else. And as a result, he didn't think nearly as hard as he might about the housekeeping, which was why Rose Cottage was such a mess. It was all he could do to put meals on the table, and he was so absent-minded that he could never remember which meal was which. So as often as not, Arthur and Lucy found themselves eating canned spaghetti for breakfast and porridge for supper. The Mildews all looked rather scruffy, for they had never had haircuts or new clothes, but there was something distinguished about them, too. There's a picture of them. Oops. Let's get in the right place. There we go. Lucy was tall and graceful, and she had hair the color of copper. Arthur had blue eyes and thick black curls, and he wore glasses with a broken frame, which kept slipping off his nose. Mine slipped down a lot, too. Mr. Mildew was the most striking of all. He always dressed in a purple smoking jacket, which was falling to bits, and he had wiry hair which stuck out of his head like insect antennae. Less imaginative children might have been embarrassed by Mr. Mildew, but Arthur and Lucy felt proud of him because he was much more interesting and exotic than anyone else's father. And he had plenty of good points. He hardly ever lost his temper, and he never nagged them to do boring things, like cleaning their teeth, or brushing their hair, or tidying their room, or doing their homework. But it wasn't easy living with someone quite so absent-minded, and now and again they did feel a bit neglected. And at the time the story begins, they had a reason to feel even more neglected than usual. It was the middle of a long, icy winter. They had known weeks and weeks of the sort of biting weather that makes it painful to be outdoors. No one could remember the village being as cold as this. The duck pond was frozen to its depths. The gargoyles on the church were dribbling icicles, and all the school water pipes had frozen solid. One night, 2 of them burst. This was a great drama, and it meant that the school had to be closed for 7 whole weeks, while something called essential renovations took place. Most of the children were overjoyed about this, for it's not every year that one's Christmas vacation is extended until February. But Arthur and Lucy weren't so pleased. For if you have a father who gives you canned spaghetti for breakfast, and you live in a cottage so cold that the butter freezes in the kitchen, then the prospect of being stuck at home all winter long is not especially appealing. Had they known that there were mice living such graceless lives in their broom cupboard, they might have felt envious. They might have even wished they were mice themselves so that they could move into Nutmouse Hall and live as the Nutmouses did. And had the Nutmouses been different, they might have turned up their noses at the mildews and felt quite superior and haughty. But TumTum and Nutmeg did not feel haughty at all. As a matter of fact, they felt rather uncomfortable. They were kind-hearted mice, and they did not think it right that they should be eating sumptuous meals in a warm house while the mildew children ate horrid glop out of cans in their icy kitchen. The Nutmouses had been concerned about Arthur and Lucy for some time, and the colder the winter became, the more their concern grew. And there comes a point at which a concern grows so big that something has to be done about it. Chapter 2. A few days after the school pipes burst, it started to snow. It was only fleeting at first. And when the Nutmouses pucked their noses outdoors after breakfast, it looked as if it might not stick. But it snowed all day, thicker and faster, and by afternoon the whole village had been blanketed. Shortly after 4 o'clock, Nutmeg visited the Mildew's kitchen to borrow a few bits and pieces for her bread and butter pudding. And there was snow blustering in under the garden door. It was so cold that she could see her breath making little gray clouds in the air. She didn't linger long, for the Mildews seldom had much worth borrowing, and this afternoon there was even less than usual. There were neither currants nor cinnamon in the cupboard, and nothing on the floor but a bit of squished banana. There was a scrap of fruitcake left on the table, but it was so stale that when Nutmeg bumped into it, she stubbed her toe. And when she climbed onto the toast rack to poke her nose down inside the milk bottle, she could see a film of white ice. Brrr! Drawing her woolen cape tight around her shoulders, she chiseled a corner off a pat of frosty butter, then scuttled as fast as she could back to Nutmouse Hall. TumTum was in the kitchen, leaning against the stove. He was hoping for some tea. "Oh, TumTum, I don't know what's to become of those mildews," Nutmeg said forlornly, plunking her wicket basket on the table. "Their kitchen's so cold that the milk started to freeze, and all the cupboards are bare. They need a fairy godmother to take charge of them." Nutmeg longed to go through Rose Cottage with her mop and pail, scrubbing and darning and mending and mothering and fussering from top to bottom. But she was only a mouse, so what use could she possibly be? She couldn't even lift one of the mildew's saucers. TumTum looked thoughtful. He knew that Nutmeg was upset about the conditions next door, and he had something to propose. "How about a little snack, Nutmeg dear?" he said, for he never liked proposing things on an empty stomach. Nutmeg scurried about the kitchen and laid the table with a dainty blue and white teapot and homemade gingerbread and macaroons and cucumber sandwiches and scones with butter and jam. But she was feeling too upset to eat more than a couple of mouthfuls. "Oh, if we could help them, TumTum," she groaned hopelessly, watching him eat. "Perhaps we can," he replied mysteriously. Then he retrieved a crumpled piece of paper from his waistcoat pocket and studied it through his crescent-shaped glasses. "I had a look around the attic this morning while the children were asleep, and I made a list of 1 or 2 things we could do," he said. "For a start, I could repair the electric heater." "Repair the heater?" Nutmeg asked incredulously. "How do you intend to do that?" There he is with his list of things that he wants to do. Very simply, TumTum replied, helping himself to a fat slice of gingerbread. "I just need to crawl inside and do a spot of rewiring. It's the sort of thing a mouse can do much more easily than a human." TumTum was keen on rewiring. He'd once rewired the whole of Nutmouse Hall. Nutmeg beamed. "Oh, "What a good idea, TumTum," she said. "Then the children won't have to sleep in their winter coats anymore." "Quite so," TumTum said, feeling rather pleased with himself. "And there's plenty more that we can see to. Arthur's glasses are about to fall apart because there are 2 screws loose in the frame. So I'll take my drill up to the attic and tighten them again." "TumTum, how wonderful!" Nutmeg cried. "And what can I do?" "All sorts of things," he said reassuringly. "You can darn some of their clothes for a start. You're a fast sewer, and if you do a small amount each evening, everything will be mended within a week or so. And you can patch their shoes, too, using the leather from that old armchair in my dressing room. I never much liked it anyway. It's rather in the way there. And why not use your clothesline to replace the lace in Arthur's boot? You hardly need it anymore now that we've got a tumble dryer." And so TumTum went on, suggesting more and more ingenious ways to help. "When can we start?" Nutmeg asked eagerly, feeling much too excited to drink her tea. "There's no time like the present," TumTum said. "I vote we set out tonight." Nutmeg agreed to this, and this was how the adventure began. Shortly after 10 o'clock, Nutmeg pressed her little brown nose through the front gate and twitched it back and forth under the dresser. Twitch, twitch, twitch. "All clear, TumTum," she called back to her husband, who was following behind her, carrying a wooden toolbox and a drill and dragging the bulky leather chair cover. Nutmeg was carrying her sewing basket and her mop and pail, and also the clothesline, which was wound about her shoulder like a lasso. They crossed the kitchen floor and crept into the hall, and then they dragged all their clobber up the baseboard, which ran along the stairs, and tiptoed across the landing. There was light glinting beneath the study door, and when they peeked underneath it, they could see Mr. Mildew crouched on the floor amid a sea of brightly colored wires and tiny shards of metal. His face was purple, and he was cursing under his breath. "Awful creature." "I wonder what he's inventing now," Nutmeg whispered. "A battery-operated mouse that gobbles all the crumbs off a dinner table like a vacuum," TumTum said knowingly. "I heard him telling Arthur about it. He thinks it's going to make him rich again. It's called the Hungry House Mouse." "Goodness," Nutmeg said. "What a curious idea. I wonder why it's making him so angry." "I believe he's got the mechanics wrong," TumTum said. "Instead of a hungry mouse, he's invented an unusually delicate one. No sooner has it gobbled up the crumbs than it throws them all up again." "What a waste," Nutmeg said, shaking her head disapprovingly. "A real mouse would do the job much better." The mice pressed on and heaved their things up the steep stairs to the attic. The room was bitterly cold, for there were no curtains to keep out the draft, and they had to blow on their paws to stop them from going numb. They had trouble getting their bearings, for it was quite dark at first. But then the clouds scudded in the wind, and the moon shone through the window onto the children's bed. Arthur was completely buried under his blankets, but they could see Lucy's hair on her pillow shining red in the moonlight. The mice worked furiously. TumTum got the heater going and drilled Arthur's glasses back into shape, and Nutmeg darned 3 pairs of socks and swept out the children's satchels. Then she climbed into the sink with her mop and polished it until it became so slippery she couldn't stand up again. TumTum had to throw the plug down to her so she could clamber free up the chain. Go. Finally, she scuttled off into the wardrobe to start mending Arthur's and Lucy's clothes. They were so full of holes that Nutmeg reckoned it would take her weeks to get through them all, and some were so threadbare it was hardly worth mending them at all. As she persevered with her tiny needle, she could hear the children's soft, steady breathing from the other side of the room. They were deeply asleep, quite innocent of all the bustle that was going on. Nutmeg felt fiercely protective of them. "Mr. Mildew is simply not capable of looking after 2 children of his own," she thought sternly, setting to work on a gaping hole in the elbow of one of Arthur's sweaters. "They need a mother, and in the absence of a human one, I will have to do." And as she set herself the responsibility of mothering the Mildews, Nutmeg felt a warm glow in her stomach. She and TumTum had never had a litter of their own, and she considered herself very blessed to be able to adopt 2 human children instead. The mice toiled away until midnight, when they decided to stop for a rest. Nutmeg had tucked 2 slices of fruit cake and a thermos of tea into her sewing basket, and they both felt much in need of them. "Bother," she said, unpacking the picnic. "I forgot to pack any plastic cups." "Never mind," said TumTum, who could feel his tummy rumbling. "We can swig from the thermos." But Nutmeg was more particular about such things. "Look Look, TumTum, she cried, pointing toward a tall pink building in the corner. Lucy's dollhouse. It's sure to have a tea set. The mice walked toward it and peered through the living room window. It was not nearly so big as their living room at Nutmouse Hall, but it was prettily furnished with pale blue curtains and a grand piano. There were 2 dolls made of pipe cleaners sitting on the sofa, and there was a case full of books by the fire. Something about the house seemed to beckon them inside. They passed underneath the white awning and pushed the front door. It swung open, leading into an airy hall with a coat rack and a grandfather clock. To the right was the kitchen, where there stood a long dining table with benches down each side. There were lots of pots and pans hanging above the stove, and Nutmeg found a whole hodgepodge of mixed-matched china in one of the cupboards. Everything was mouse-sized. Nutmeg set the table, and they both sat down, feeling very civilized. We still got an awful lot to do, Nutmeg said wearily, and if we don't finish tonight, we'll have to lug all our stuff back upstairs again tomorrow night. We needn't do that, Nutmeg, TumTum replied. We could leave everything here in the dollhouse. We could tuck it all away somewhere so Lucy won't find it. Oh, TumTum, what a good idea, she cried. Then we can just come back and do more chores whenever we've had time. So they worked for another hour or so. Then they crept back to the dollhouse and put the toolbox and the sewing basket in the cupboard under the stairs. The mop and pail wouldn't fit, so Nutmeg hid them behind the kitchen door. Then, by instinct, she cleared away their cups and plates from the table and put them in the dollhouse sink. There was no running water, but she could fill it next time with her bucket. I do so like this dollhouse, TumTum. Feels a bit like camping, Nutmeg said, and she thought that next time she came she would bring a new tablecloth for the kitchen. TumTum was longing to get home, for he was quite exhausted, but Nutmeg found it a wrench to leave. She would have given anything to have seen the children's faces when they woke up to find their heater working, for by now the attic was lovely and warm. We could spend the night here, she suggested, but TumTum was having none of it. That would be very rash, Nutmeg, he said. They might see us. They both agreed that that would not do at all, for some humans have funny feelings toward mice. So TumTum took his wife by the paw, and they scuttled back to Nutmouse Hall and collapsed into their 4-poster bed. Chapter 3. The Nutmouses became regular visitors to the attic and thought of more and more things to do. TumTum bought a bag of cement and used it to seal all the little cracks in the attic window panes, and he climbed up onto the roof and patched the leak with a big roll of linoleum, which he had stripped out of one of the bathrooms in Nutmouse Hall. Nutmeg polished Arthur's train set and mopped the children's shoes, and she spent one entire night sorting out their sock drawer. She also left tiny presents under the pillows, silver candlesticks from her banqueting hall, and bars of chocolate the size of raisins. Day after day, the children woke up to discover some new delight. Lucy was most pleased about the tidying and the mending, and Arthur was most pleased about the presents, but they were both equally mystified. Lucy, who was the eldest, said there must be a fairy in the house. But Arthur had given up believing in fairies long ago, and he wasn't at all convinced. Then one day, he opened his pencil case and found that all his pencils had been sharpened in a most peculiar way. They looked as though they'd been nibbled. Well, that can't have been done by a fairy, he thought. A fairy would have small, delicate teeth, not sharp, spiky ones that could nibble graphite. Later that week, another strange thing happened. On Friday afternoon, one of Arthur's teeth fell out, and before going to bed, he put it on the dresser, thinking he might find somewhere to hide it away next day. But when he woke up, the tooth had gone. In its place, there was a tin the size of a penny, and inside it a cake covered with white icing and walnuts. The tiniest cake either child had ever seen. Well, that means it must be a tooth fairy, Lucy said firmly. Only tooth fairies take teeth away. There he is, finding his little tiny cake. But tooth fairies leave money, not cake, Arthur said. The tooth fairy had never come for him before, but it came for his friends, and he knew that they usually got at least 50 pence, and sometimes more. And tooth fairies only come when you lose a tooth. But our fairy, or rather our, he corrected himself, our, whatever it is, it comes all the time. In truth, neither child knew what to think. If it wasn't a fairy, then it could be a ghost. But that was such a frightening option that neither of them liked to suggest it. Eventually, Lucy proposed doing something decisive. I think we should write whoever it is a letter asking them for a visit, she said. But what if it's well, what if it's, something funny? Arthur asked nervously. The thought of confronting their mysterious visitor face to face made his stomach feel quite hollow. Well, whatever it is, it would be better to know, Lucy said. Arthur wasn't so sure, but he didn't want Lucy thinking that he was frightened, so he reluctantly agreed. Lucy went to her desk and tore a sheet of paper out of a workbook. Then, after some deliberation, she and Arthur composed the following message. To whoever has been visiting us, thank you very much for everything you have done. If you are a fairy and not a ghost, then would you like to come and have tea with us here in the attic tomorrow? Love, Arthur and Lucy Mildew. P.S. Please come at 4 o'clock. Lucy folded the piece of paper in half and addressed one side to the visitor, the attic, Rose Cottage. Then she left it propped up against the mirror on the dresser. Arthur felt anxious all day. Something told him that their visitor might not be at all like the fairies he had seen pictures of in Lucy's books. The Nutmouses discovered the letter that night and dragged it back to Nutmouse Hall. They sat a long while in their kitchen with it spread out in front of them, all over the table, wondering what to do. Nutmeg longed to accept, but TumTum forbade it. You certainly can't go, Nutmeg, he said firmly. Imagine what a shock it would be for them to find that their visitor was a mouse. Forlornly, Nutmeg agreed. Humans can be so frosty toward mice. There was simply too much misunderstanding between the two species. And what if the children told Mr. Mildew about them? There was no knowing how he'd react. He might try to evict them from their home, even though the Nutmouse family had been living in Rose Cottage much longer than the Mildews had. But there was another reason why Nutmeg couldn't introduce herself, and that was because conversation would be impossible. For mice have such tiny voices that the human ear can't pick up a word they say. Even when a mouse is shouting and bellowing at the top of his voice, a human only hears a faint squeal. But TumTum had an idea. You must certainly tell them that you're not a fairy. No, that you're a fairy, not a ghost, for otherwise they might get frightened, he said. But say that you can't accept their invitation because fairies aren't allowed to be seen by humans. And if they are seen, their magic powers stop working. I'm sure they'll understand that. Nutmeg agreed that this was a sensible solution, so she found a big piece of blotting paper. Mouse writing paper would have been too small. In a much larger handwriting than she normally used, she wrote the following reply. My dear Arthur and Lucy, I am a fairy of sorts, but sadly I cannot accept your kind invitation because my magic powers would fade if you were ever to set eyes on me. But if there is anything more I can do for you, then just leave me another note on the dresser. Love. She was about to sign herself Mrs. Nutmouse, but she hesitated, thinking it sounded too mousy. So instead she put Nutmeg, which was much more the sort of name a fairy might have. Then on TumTum's advice, she added a postscript. P.S. It is best not to tell anyone else about me because that would make my magic powers fade too. She folded the letter into an envelope which she addressed to Arthur and Lucy Mildew, the attic, Rose Cottage. Then before having his bath, TumTum delivered it for her, tiptoeing back upstairs to leave it on the dresser, leaning against the handle of Lucy's hairbrush. When Lucy first picked up the brush the next morning, she didn't see the note. But then she noticed a tiny piece of paper fluttering to the floor. Nutmeg's writing was very wobbly, like a drunken spider, TumTum always said. But Lucy managed to decipher it using Arthur's magnifying glass. I wonder what a fairy of sorts looks like, Arthur said when she read it out loud. A fairy of sorts didn't sound nearly as frightening as a ghost. In fact, it sounded rather nice. But even so, he felt relieved he wouldn't have to actually meet Nutmeg, for he still felt a little unsure of her. But Lucy was longing to meet her. I wonder where fairies of sorts live, she said wonderingly. She felt very frustrated to think she might never find out. But as she went to hide the letter in the drawer of her bedside table, where she put all her most important things, something about the dollhouse caught her eye. She knelt down to look more closely. She hadn't played with it for a whole week, and now everything seemed different. The door knocker had been polished, and inside lots of things had been meddled with. The piano lid was open, and the kitchen sink was full of water. There were dishes on the draining board, and then there was a tiny pair of pink slippers beside the bed upstairs. Lucy felt a sudden thrill. Arthur, she said urgently, Nutmeg has moved in. The nut mouses had really moved in, of course. Here they are looking inside the dollhouse. They hadn't moved in, of course, because they had a very grand home of their own. But they looked in on the dollhouse as a bit of adventure. And as the days passed, they'd become much bolder about making use of it. When they had been working especially late in the attic, they sometimes spent the night there, despite TumTum's initial concerns. So when the children scrutinized each room in turn, they noticed all of Nutmeg's efforts to make it more homely. There were new gingham curtains in the kitchen and new cushions on the living room sofa, and there were soft white towels in the bathroom. There were also hairs on the pillows in the bedroom, gray on one side of the bed and brown on the other. "She's got funny hair," Lucy said. "It looks a bit mousy." Arthur did not comment. He never noticed what people's hair was like, but when he saw how nice and cozy the fairy of sorts had made the dollhouse, his fears of her at once evaporated. She seemed almost human. "We should leave Nutmeg something to eat," he said. "She can't visit with us, then we might at least leave her a snack in the dollhouse." Lucy agreed. So after supper, they waited until their father disappeared to his study, then salvaged the last bit of shortbread from the cookie jar and crumbled part of it on one of the little plates in the dollhouse kitchen. Then they poured a teaspoonful of milk into one of the jugs and laid a place at the table. They even supplied a tiny napkin cut out of a cotton handkerchief. The Mildews never used napkins themselves, but Lucy thought Nutmeg might appreciate one. Next day, the shortbread and the milk had gone, and there was a letter on the table in the dollhouse kitchen. Lucy picked up the magnifying glass and read it out loud. "Dear Arthur and Lucy, thank you for a most magnificent feast. Your shortbread was superb, and I ate much more than I should have. I must acquire the recipe one day. I hope you did not mind me making use of your dollhouse, but it is very convenient to have somewhere to leave my things. Love, Nutmeg." After that, Lucy and Arthur agreed that they should leave Nutmeg something to eat every night, and they both agreed that life was much, much more interesting now that they had a fairy of sorts looking after them. And that's the first 3 chapters of TumTum and Nutmeg. And I hope that you enjoyed today's chapters and look forward to next week. We'll be reading more chapters and hear more about their adventures beyond Nutmouse Hall. Thanks for joining me today. Hope to see you soon. The sun was shining today. I hope you got outside to enjoy the sunshine a little bit. Stay home. Be safe. Miss you. Bye.